in the Department of Biology here at UNC Chapel Hill. His research is focused on marine biodiversity and macroecology. He also is focused on coral reef ecology and conservation and the impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems. His PhD was in ecology from Brown University, where he studied both ecology and evolutionary biology, and he was a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University in disease ecology. The research in his lab is focused on understanding and conserving the structure and dynamics of ocean ecosystems. He primarily works in the Caribbean, including Belize, the Bahamas, and Cuba, but he also works here in coastal North Carolina and in Ecuador on applied wetland projects and in shallow subtidal habitats that occur in the Galapagos Islands. Please welcome Dr. Bruno.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much, Ron. I am so thrilled and honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Are there any teachers here from Scroggs Elementary School? How about Colbreth Middle? All right. And Carborough High? So I have daughters in all three of those schools. I have been immensely impressed with the level of science and the other topics that are being taught. So my elementary school kids are even learning things that I didn't learn until high school, and my middle school daughter in 7th grade is covering topics I covered maybe in college. My 9th grader last night was doing a project on molecular phylogenetics, interpreting phylogenetic trees. It's just unbelievable what kids are learning these days. And it's literally caused me to revamp some of the materials in my college classes, just realizing they're coming in with a lot more knowledge than I did. So really kind of bringing the level up. So the topic of my talk, climate change and its impact on ocean ecosystems, the timing couldn't have been better. There's so much going on. It's going to be the warmest year on record, almost surely. We've got a massive El Nino just arriving, a big global coral bleaching event just beginning, and a really important conference in late November in Paris about climate change. And there's so many exciting things happening in the field. And I'll get to all that, but I want to start with what may be a surprising fact. 94% of the additional heat being absorbed by the Earth system due to the human-caused, human-exacerbated greenhouse effect goes into the ocean. So when we think about global warming and when you see depictions of global warming on the news and then other media, you'd probably think about land and atmosphere warming. But it's almost all happening in the ocean. And we think of that sometimes as a good thing, as in, all right, cool, the ocean's absorbing a lot of that heat, so it's not going into the atmosphere and warming the air. It doesn't work like that. The ocean gives all that heat back to us in one way or another. Of course, the ocean really drives our climate. We're dependent on the ocean economically, socially, culturally, so it's all going to come back to bite us. And of course, global warming is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, primarily the burning of fossil fuels for transportation and manufacturing and warming our houses on mornings like this morning. The concentration of CO2 has been going up over the last, let me just flip this, okay, over the last, I got a dead battery, that's all right. Been going up really over the last couple of thousand years. It started going up just when we started land clearing in Europe and other places, burning forests, but it's really taken off in the last couple of decades. And we reached a milestone a couple of years ago. We crossed 400 parts per million. We haven't seen that in millions of years on Earth. So this is a really unique circumstance. And what it's doing, of course, is exacerbating a natural phenomena, the global greenhouse effect. So energy comes in from the sun, solar energy. It warms the surface of the Earth, including the ocean. A portion of that energy is returned back to the system, back to the atmosphere as infrared radiation, and greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere trap that heat and radiate it back towards the Earth. So the greater the concentration of greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere, the stronger that greenhouse effect. Thank you. Great. Thanks. Can I have an espresso too? So that greenhouse effect leaves a number of fingerprints, and these fingerprints are the proof that carbon dioxide is causing global warming and a variety of other changes in our system. So we've got an increase in humidity. Let's see if I have a laser pointer. Sea level rise is increasing. Ice sheets are decreasing. Sea ice is decreasing. Ocean heat content is increasing. Every single physical factor that should be responding to increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is in the direction that is predicted by basic physical theory. We also have a lot of biological responses. So tree lines are shifting upward in elevation and poleward. Spring's coming earlier. Species are migrating. So biologists like to say, we don't even need the temperature data or the melting glaciers or the ice. We can see it in the biology. Great indicators. So there's no question that this is happening. Now, this is an incredibly warm year. Global warming, although it's global, it's very patchy. So some parts of the Earth, in fact, are cooling. Some parts are warming much faster than others. So the Arctic is warming generally far more quickly than the rest of the Earth. But this year, almost everywhere is seeing record high temperatures. So these are record warm areas, much warmer than average. And these are the only cool areas. And you can see there's a whole lot of red. And this is data through August of this year. And that's going to lead to an incredibly warm year, far warmer than anything else humans have experienced in history. So this is 2015. Again, the data go through the summertime. The last really warm years, 2010, 2014, are obviously far cooler. And the last big El Nino year is 1998. I'm going to talk a lot about El Nino because the reason we're seeing such a big jump this year is due to the onset of a major El Nino, which we've been predicting for about 2 years, and it's just really taken off. So what is El Nino? It's a natural phenomena. It's a natural cycle. It takes place in the Pacific Ocean. So under normal conditions, winds blow generally offshore. So this is meant to be kind of a 3D diagram of the Pacific. This is South America, Central America, North America, so we're right there. Normally, winds blow offshore, and they move water on the surface to the west. And the movement of that water draws up deeper ocean water, and that's what this is, the deep thermocline. It's really cold water, 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, and it comes up along the coast. So that's why the water's so cold along northern Central America, even though you're still in the tropics. It's also incredibly nutrient-rich water, and that's why you get this incredibly productive fishery off of Peru in particular. So these are normal conditions. Under El Nino conditions, those winds relax, and this big warm tongue of water kind of sloshes back to the east across the equator onto the shore of Peru. Peruvian fishermen are usually the first people that know that an El Nino is coming because the water turns clear and calm, and the fish totally disappear, and you really quickly start seeing signs in the marine mammals on shore. They get skinny because they're hungry. Seabirds disappear. So really striking ecological changes before oceanographers even kind of pick this up with satellites and other monitoring devices. So this is an El Nino condition. Pacific water gets much warmer, and that change is what really drives the peaks we've been seeing over the last 30 or 40 years. So we've got this increased warming trend that's again caused by greenhouse gases. That's global warming. This variability is caused largely by natural intrinsic factors in the system. And the El Nino cycle is a big part of that. So these red years, the especially warm years, are all the El Nino years. Blue years are what we call La Nina years, so the little girl, and those are the opposite. So the winds blow especially hard out of the east across Central America and create supercharged upwelling, and the Pacific cools off. Now, the phenomena confuses a lot of people, and it's used by a lot of folks that work for the oil industry and other organizations that just want to essentially spread confusion about global warming. And they use the variability to essentially try to trick the public into thinking that there's either been a pause in global warming or that the Earth is cooling. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh my goodness, in 1998 it was this warm, and then in 2006 it was this warm. Clearly there's global cooling. Or they'll argue simply that there's been a pause. There's been no pause. There's just natural variability. And global warming is a 30 to 50-year phenomena. You need 30 years of data to even begin to assess whether it's happening. And you can obviously see there's a really strong trend. And so we like to say that global warming deniers are going down the up escalator. So this is how they view the temperature record: no change at all, or just a cooling, when in reality, over the long term, there's clearly been a lot of warming. And you can statistically remove the effect of not just the El Nino cycle, but also other natural phenomena like volcanoes and variability in the strength of the solar, the energy coming in from the sun, and you get a much cleaner signal. So this is largely the greenhouse gas signal, how it's affecting our temperature. There's obviously still some variability caused by other factors that we can't yet explain, just probably natural variability in the system. Some of these could even be social economic factors. So the recession in 2007 drove a measurable decline in greenhouse gas emissions. So the point is, we're always going to have this natural variability. It's never going to go away. And it's interesting, we didn't really know what was going to happen with El Nino 20, 30 years ago. We thought it might become stronger with global warming, or it might kind of disappear with global warming. But it's actually kind of remained constant, but it's kind of being elevated every couple years by the natural trends, or by the anthropogenic trends, sorry. So again, a very strong El Nino has begun. This is deviations from the normal in degrees Celsius. So this is 5-degree deviation from the normal here. So that's what we're seeing in the Central Pacific. The yellow is less than between 0.5 degree Celsius and 1 degree Celsius. And interestingly, it's not just the Pacific, but the whole planet that warms. And what's essentially going on is heat is being released from the ocean, given back into the upper surface of the ocean and to the atmosphere. So there's no new heat being created. It's just a redistribution of heat. And it also affects the Caribbean. And it's a phenomena oceanographers called telekinesis. And what that really means is we don't know what the heck's going on, but for some reason, the Caribbean also warms during these El Nino events. And the Florida is about 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. Cuba, Belize, Bahamas, those oceans are all warmer than what they would normally be this time of year. And in my world, that's causing a lot of panic because, as you may have seen in the news last week, NOAA announced the third global bleaching event. The last one was in 1998, and that was during the last big El Nino. We've had a couple smaller El Ninos since then, but 98 was the last big one. So I'm going to tell you all about bleaching, but I wanted to first show you this picture. A friend of mine took this yesterday off the big island of Hawaii. So relatively healthy, pristine reefs. This was a reef with high coral cover, and this individual coral is obviously totally white. That's why we call it bleaching. It looks like it's been bleached. And really, the whole entire reefscape was all white. The only part that's not white is actually corals that have already died. They've died in the last couple of weeks. You can see some right in here, and they're already being covered by really thin filamentous algae. So once the animal dies, the dead calcium carbonate skeleton gets colonized by algae and sponges and all kinds of critters. So that's what we're seeing all across the Hawaiian Islands, and we'll be seeing that really through next June or July, probably, if the El Nino holds constant, because summertime's coming up in Australia, and the Great Barrier Reef generally bleaches about 6 months after the Caribbean and the Pacific. So, a little bit about coral reefs, so we can kind of put this into context. So coral reefs are a tropical marine environment. They exist in shallow, clear water. Corals need sunlight to survive and to grow. This shows the distribution of reefs around the world. Most coral reefs, about 80%, are in the Indo-Pacific. We call this the coral triangle. This is the biodiversity hotspot for all kinds of marine critters. crabs and shrimp and fish and corals. You get about 10 times more species here than you do in the Caribbean. So this is where most of the action is. So corals build up reefs over thousands of years. This is an aerial photograph from just north of Cancun in Mexico, and you can see the reef here. This is the extant or current reef. This is obviously the shore, so it would be about 30 to 45 feet here. This reef's maybe 5,000 years old. And then they're built up over time by corals. Some corals are little. This is a really big one, maybe 15 feet across. This would be like an 800-year-old animal. So over time, the corals accrete a calcium carbonate skeleton and kind of grow up this structure. But it takes thousands of years to really create the structure. So what is a coral? So it's a colonial animal. It's in the phylum Cnidaria, so it's related to things like jellyfish. And unlike jellyfish, corals create this skeleton. So it's, again, a calcium carbonate skeleton. And the coral animal is kind of like a thin veneer of tissue that sits on top of the skeleton. And they live in these cooperative aggregations called colonies. And the colonies are made up of hundreds or thousands of these individual polyps. And the polyps look kind of like upside-down jellyfish with tentacles sticking up. So there's the total coral colony. There's a group of polyps kind of zoomed in, and that's what each individual polyp looks like. It's got a little mouth. It's surrounded by a ring of tentacles, and then they each sit in a little home called a corallite. And they create this home, and they can retract their polyps into it. Generally, they retract them during the day and expand them at night, and that's where their gonads and other structures are down inside this cavity. So the skeleton's really porous and intricate. It's really interesting. Now, the key to coral reefs is a symbiosis, a positive relationship between the animal host, the cnidarian, the coral, and the symbiotic microscopic plants that live within their tissues. They're called zooxanthellae. This is what they look like. So they're just single-celled dinoflagellates. They have a little flagellus. They can swim if they're outside of the coral animal. And they provide a number of benefits to the coral, so they give it most of its food. So they're really leaky. They leak simple sugars, some somewhat complex carbohydrates, and they essentially feed the coral internally. They also provide oxygen to it via photosynthesis. They are critical in calcification, so they help maintain a pH environment that maximizes the rate of calcification, the creation of the skeleton for the coral. And the corals also benefit the zooxanthellae. It's a nice, safe place to live. Nobody's going to eat you inside the coral tissue generally. They give them nutrients via just excretion of ammonia from metabolism. So it's a really nice, tight symbiosis. The problem is it gets really stressed out. So like most breakups, bleaching is caused primarily by stress, and in this case, thermal stress, but other stresses can also cause bleaching. And so the zooxanthellae are generally expelled from the coral tissue. When the water gets warm, they start getting really excited, and they start photosynthesizing especially quickly, and then they start kicking out oxygen radicals and other toxic compounds. The corals don't like that, so they just expel the zooxanthellae out, and the corals turn white like this. So corals can recover from bleaching either by an expansion of the zooxanthellae populations within their tissue or potentially by taking up new zooxanthellae from the environment, ones that are floating around in the water. And so these are photographs of corals that were bleached in October 87, and by August of 1990, they obviously had reacquired all their zooxanthellae, and they were still alive. This is a brain coral, and this is a coral in the genus Orbicella, a really important species in the Caribbean. So individual colonies can recover. Whether or not they do depends on a whole variety of factors, flow velocity, their nutritional state, how stressed out they were the previous winter, so what the wintertime temperatures were, the density of zooplankton, because these corals are photosynthesizing via their zooxanthellae, but they're also capturing little critters like little worms and arthropods at night, so how much food's available in the water column affects that. But critically is how long the temperatures remain elevated and how much above normal conditions they get. And it doesn't take much. So a degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 weeks is enough to cause severe bleaching. And if it's 2 degrees Celsius above normal, they're generally toast. The mortality will be 90 to 100%. So this is not a big warming that causes these changes. So coral populations can also recover. So just because they all die doesn't necessarily mean the reef will always stay dead. So reefs can recover, and they always have historically, right? So here's a reef that was really healthy in 2006. This is the Great Barrier Reef, where these big plating corals dominate. Corals were wiped out by a storm in 2010. They started coming back in 2012. There's little individuals here. And by 2014, things were getting back to normal. So in 10 or 20 years, you can have a lot of coral coming back. The problem is really the frequency of the disturbances. So reefs worldwide, I would not be concerned if bleaching events were happening every 50 years or every 20 years. The concern is that they're going to start happening every decade or every 5 years or every El Nino. So that's when we're going to really get into trouble, when the frequency of these disturbances just becomes too much for these natural recovery processes to kind of rejuvenate the populations. Now, despite the fact that individuals can recover and populations can recover, nevertheless, we've been seeing a global decline in coral pretty much everywhere we've looked. And that's measured by the percentage of the seafloor that's covered by living coral. So a 50% cover coral reef would be relatively healthy. So there'd be a lot of cover along the seafloor. 5 or 10% is becoming more the norm. Historically, we think that the average reef had maybe 50 to 75% coral cover. The rest of the surface was occupied by other taxa sponges, gorgonians, some seaweed, and some other stuff. So this is a study we published 8 or 9 years ago. We accumulated data from about 2,700 reefs across the Indo-Pacific. So here's the Great Barrier Reef, Papua New Guinea, and this really diverse area of Indonesia and the Philippines. And this is the general trend in coral cover. So at the beginning of the data set we had, which was only like 79, these data do not go back very far. So this is a really new field. Nobody was quantitatively measuring things like fish biomass or coral diversity even 40 or 50 years ago. But we started about 48%, and we got down to about 22%. And this ended in 2003. There's been studies that have come out since. The Great Barrier Reef is now at 14% coral cover. So it's gone from maybe 50 to 70 to 14% just in 25 years. I mean, this has all happened really quickly. And this is a massive ecosystem. You know, this is 1,500 kilometers from the bottom to the top. So this is a huge scale. The way we collect these data are with scuba diving. So this is me working in Jamaica. You lay out this transect tape, and we take photographs of the seafloor, and then we come back to the lab and analyze the photographs. And this is the kind of thing I've done in schools. So there's a lot of images online. You can do this. And there's some amazing new technologies now using machine learning, where you actually train a computer via artificial intelligence to analyze the images for you. And you kind of do it every day, and then overnight the computer thinks about it, and it networks with a bunch of other computers, and the next day it kind of spits out the data, and you tell it what it got right and wrong, and within a couple of weeks it's automating it and doing it for you. It's really cool. So as an aside, when I got into marine biology, I thought it meant this: scuba diving, you know, riding around on the ship like Jacques Cousteau, drinking wine, you know, hanging out. That's not what it's about. It's me and my laptop alone together, right? Sending email, writing proposals, doing statistical analyses. That's science. But that's what I thought it was. But we're also seeing that coral loss everywhere we look. So an undergrad student did this project in my lab about 8 years ago. So she did the same kind of thing, amassed lots of studies, hundreds of studies from all across the Caribbean, and we see the same decline. So the average was about 40% because the decline had started before anybody started surveying these reefs, and now it's about 16%. So we're losing corals everywhere. Now, a healthy coral reef is kind of a mosaic of a variety of forms, different kinds of corals. So in the Caribbean, we would have lots of branching corals and big boulder corals. This is the Orbicella. These are staghorn corals from the genus Acropora. And what those corals do functionally for the rest of the community is create hiding places, little niches and nooks where they can hide from their predators. So if you were a prey species and you swam out from here, you'd be nailed. It'd be like 10 seconds and you'd be gone. Because unlike a Carolina forest, it's kind of this nice, peaceful, pristine place today because the predators are all gone. You know, we used to have saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves and mammoths wandering around our forests. Now there's like no predation at all practically. A coral reef, there's just barracuda and sharks swimming around. So that predation refuge is really what the corals provide for the rest of the community. Both of these species are now listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act as threatened, both the Acropora and the Orbicella. So Acropora were the dominant Caribbean coral, kind of like pine trees across Carolina. They dominated reefs all across the Caribbean. They're practically extinct. They're still present, but it's really hard to find them. And that's like 30 years gone. So big dramatic changes. That said, we're not necessarily worried about losing these species. The concern is that we're losing the habitat, the structure they provide. And because what we're really trying to conserve is not necessarily the corals, but the inhabitants, all the invertebrates and all the fishes that we depend on for fisheries and ecotourism. I mean, reefs are worth far more than the most productive corporation, Apple Computer, on Earth. Reefs are worth many billions of dollars in fisheries and tourism revenue generation. And when we lose the corals, we lose all of that, as well as a variety of other systems, other services they provide to people, like protection from storms and whatnot. So this isn't just a concern about biodiversity and ethics, but there's a real social, economic reason to conserve reefs. And we call corals foundation species. So they create the foundation of the structure. And these are just other examples of foundation species, things like mussels and trees and seagrass. And for many of these species, we have the same concern, not necessarily trying to conserve them for the sake of conserving them, but to protect the whole habitat ecosystem that they facilitate simply by their presence. All right, so one way biology, ecology is being affected by global warming is what I've just described. It's kind of simply death. So species just die and either disappear locally or regionally or possibly even globally, but that's really unlikely. The other way is by changing composition. And that's where it's really interesting. I mean, the death is very kind of doom and gloomy. There is some interesting things scientifically happening with that. Some populations acclimatize or adapt to warmer temperatures, and they seem to be thriving. But where the really exciting conceptual action is now in my field, global change ecology, is changes in composition and how that affects function. So this is an individual coral that I did an experiment with in 2003. It was part of a big disease experiment I was doing. So we tagged lots of colonies and tracked disease, and we did some local nutrient additions. So this is like a 3-meter stick. So this is about a 12 to 15 foot colony, probably again many centuries, 800-900 years old, and it's dead now. So it was infected with a disease that's related to ocean warming in 2001, and now it's dead. But it's been colonized now by different cnidarian taxa. So these are sea fans, and these are all soft corals that are also cnidarians. And there's some hard corals colonizing it as well that you can't see too well. So while we're losing the big structure-forming species, we're gaining lots of other species. So mostly weedy taxa, stuff that can tolerate warm temperatures and that recruit and grow really quickly. And that's that shift in composition. So the impact of global warming is not just about like depletion and loss. It's more about change in composition, change in function, kind of the identity to which species live in the system. And we'll see the same thing here in North Carolina. And this really brings us to sea snakes. Anybody hear about this? This is insane. So sea snakes from the tropics are washing up on the beach in Southern California. This is all over the internet. And it's not just sea snakes, but it's all kinds of other weird critters. And it's all driven, again, by this short-term warming that is El Nino. And here, Southern California, you can see how much warmer it is now than normal. So 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than normal. And that's what's enabling those sea snakes that otherwise could not tolerate the really cool waters off San Diego and Los Angeles to kind of survive there, at least temporarily. I mean, once the El Nino ends and the water's cool, they'll all die or have to migrate back to where they came from. But that's the useful thing about El Nino for scientists. It kind of gives us a short-term natural manipulation of temperature to see really what the ocean is going to look like and function like 30 to 40 years from now, when this is no longer anomalous, when this is the norm. And we'll get there literally in 25, 30 years. The temperatures that we're seeing today will be the norm, and the extremes will be another 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer. So it's kind of a nice natural experiment. We get really excited about it, even though it's kind of gloom and doomy. But it's also useful for the public and politicians to really point out what the impacts and implications of warming are. You know, it's better than a scientific paper or a graph or a number. It's like, there's sea snakes on the beach, you know? So those are the kind of problems. And it's not just sea snakes, it's like giant oarfish. Look at that creepy thing. So, you know, people are wading out into the ocean and pulling these things ashore all across California. By the way, this is from Facebook, and if you're a marine biologist, this is what your Facebook feed looks like. Just like crazy, weird stuff from the ocean. And thousands of tiny red crabs filling the ocean. I mean, there's dozens of species that have moved up. And, you know, we see the same thing off North Carolina. So we're seeing more and more tropical species invading our offshore reefs, our estuaries. Mangroves are moving north across Georgia into South Carolina. So species are responding not just to short-term El Nino, but to the longer-term warming by changing their range. So that's a really common phenomenon, species modifying their range. And, you know, they're not doing it consciously. It's not like individuals moving to a new place. So all these marine organisms have a larval stage where the babies get released into the water column as tiny larvae. Sometimes they look nothing like the adult form. And they'll float sometimes for weeks or months, traveling hundreds or thousands of miles to a potential new home. Most of them never make it. Most of them starve to death, get eaten, or just plop down in a completely inappropriate environment that's either too warm or too cold. But they're constantly sending out larvae, and it's essentially the larvae landing in a place that's warmed and surviving that creates this phenomena. So essentially moving to higher latitudes in response to warming. Now, this is how we really do science. Again, like I said, I thought it was scuba diving and hanging out on the beach. It's mostly a bunch of nerds in a room with laptops, like crunching through gigantic Excel spreadsheets and coding, you know, with computer code. I've been part of a working group for about 5 years. It's an international group. This guy's from Scotland. He can drink like 30 beers a night and shows no effect of it. So people from all over the world, a really smart German. Anyway, so we've been asking the question, what are the general trends in responses of the ocean to climate change? So the way we study this is essentially with time series data. So we meaning, you know, the entire field, hundreds or thousands of people. So we want time series data. We want surveys of a population or a community where somebody goes out and counts how many individuals there are. Then they do it every year, or at least every 5 years, and we want them to do it for like a minimum of 30 years, because again, that's how long it takes to pick up a signal from a long-term trend like anthropogenic climate change. And so then what we look for is changes in like declines in abundance, or changes in phenology when the animal spawns or grows. So marine animals have phenology just like leaves and, you know, plants in your garden. So those kind of changes in response to the warming. And so we put together this big data set that was part of the last IPCC AR5 report. Does anybody read that report? Not one okay, did anybody download it and not read it? That's what most people do. Like, I'm going to read this. And it's like 800 pages long. But we did publish it in the scientific literature, and there's blog posts about it that kind of describe it more succinctly. But anyway, it's 200 or so studies, 857 species, all these observations, and the median duration is 41 years. So just tracking things through time. And one of the things we did was create the first map of what's called climate change velocity. So what you normally think about in terms of climate change is the rate of warming, how quickly the surface of the Earth and the ocean is warming. And that's this map. This is the temperature change that we observed during the satellite record, which goes back to about 2003. And so it's changed per decade. The oceans have warmed by about 1 degree Fahrenheit on average. And you can see there's a lot of variability. So places that have warmed and parts of the Southern Ocean have cooled. And then there's the spatial gradient. And that's kind of the gradient in temperature. So in some parts of the ocean, you can travel 10 kilometers and it might get 3 degrees Celsius cooler. In other parts of the ocean, you'd have to travel 1,000 kilometers to detect any change in temperature. And that's just a natural gradient. You know, you can think of it, if you're walking across a flat plain like the Piedmont, you could walk forever and it wouldn't get any cooler. But if you're out in the mountains in the Smokies, you could walk 10 miles and you'd go up and it would drop like 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So those kind of gradients also exist in the ocean, those temperature gradients. And those are really important because they really dictate how far an animal population has to move to maintain a constant temperature, because that's effectively what they're doing. So if it gets too hot here, they want to move over here. And the tighter the gradient, the less they have to move. So we wanted to estimate really how far do animals have to move to stay in a thermal environment, their thermal niche that they're pre-adapted to. So in other words, really how quickly do populations have to change their ranges. And that's what this figure is. It's the velocity of climate change in kilometers per decade. And of course, it varies enormously because it's a function of the change in the gradient. And in some places, they only have to migrate 5 kilometers per decade, in others 50 to 200 kilometers per decade. And the point is, in the tropics is where they really have to migrate quickly. They've got to really get up and move if they want to keep up with climate change. And the next thing we did, and a lot of other groups are starting to do this too, is ask the question, how many species are actually doing this? Are they responding in this way, moving to new places in order to maintain a constant temperature environment? And it turns out that they are. They're moving remarkably quickly. I mean, shockingly quickly. So this is just the average values across a bunch of different taxa, algae, mollusks, things like clams and mussels mostly, crustaceans, crabs, phytoplankton, zooplankton, baby bony fish, non-bony fish, things like sharks and rays, bony fish, seabirds. And if this is actually phenology, and so it's the number of days per decade that the phenology is shifting. And so the average is somewhere between 5 and 10 days per decade. So animals are really changing their phenologies, the timing of reproduction, the timing of migrations, all kinds of things in response to warming. So that's one of those other signals that we know this is happening. And this is actually essentially good news because it shows us biodiversity is, in one sense, adapting to warming. This is the change in distribution, so how quickly they're actually moving. And it comes from data where people observe kind of the ranges of populations, and you can actually estimate how quickly they're moving spatially through time. And again, it varies enormously among groups, and even within groups, some populations don't move at all, some move a lot. But they're moving on average 20, 40, 50 kilometers per decade. So that's pretty quickly. So again, that's essentially a form of adaptation to a change in the global environment. So it's essentially a good news thing. Generally, it's not good news for everybody, so these seaweeds are kind of screwed. So this is Australia, and this comes from an incredible study of herbarium specimens, thousands of records of where algae live across both the west coast of Australia and the east coast. And most of their ranges are shifting southward, which makes sense if Australia is warming, which it is. The problem being that what's below Australia? Oblivion. So these seaweed are not shifting into a new happy home. I mean, they're shifting into the Southern Ocean, so they're going to be extinct. And the same is true for lots of critters ultimately. So they can't range shift forever. Corals have been moving from the Keys. They're now off Fort Lauderdale, even Jupiter, where I grew up, Jupiter Tequesta, Florida. We're seeing corals that haven't been there in thousands of years. And they'll range shift up to, a little bit farther north, Hope Sound, Jacksonville maybe. They're not coming to North Carolina, even if it gets warm enough, because we have no appropriate substrate. There's no hard substrate and 10, 20 feet of water out there. We have big rivers that dump a lot of muddy sediment onto the reefs. So it's an inappropriate habitat in other ways, even though the temperature will be just fine for them here in 50, 80 years. This is not just an interesting ecological phenomena, it's a huge issue in fisheries right now. So the fish that you catch are moving to a new place. This is a study that came out in 2013. And so let's just look at lobster. This is lobster right here, and these green dots are essentially where the population was at each year. And they started out here, and they're essentially moving here. So the lobster populations are moving north. These are Pacific cod. They're moving out this way. Skates are moving down the coast of California. So they're all moving to higher latitudes in general. And it's not necessarily a problem globally, but locally it's a huge problem because the fishermen in New Bedford, Massachusetts have lobster traps. They don't have rods and reels. They don't have ships to go out and catch the fish that move in. So that means a complete retooling of the local fishery because pretty soon, the Canadians will be excited about this because they'll get the Maine lobster. We're not going to have lobster in Maine, New Hampshire, and they're already gone from Rhode Island in 50 years. So that's a big social shift. And it's not just like the equipment, right? It's cultural. So these people have been lobstering for generations. So it's a big change, and NOAA and organizations that manage fisheries are really grappling to deal with that kind of change now. So this is where ecologists get really excited. So the migration of these species is essentially creating what we call no analog communities. So these are communities that, as far as we know, have never existed in the history of the Earth. So they're combinations of animals that have never existed. And we're mixing up a whole bunch of animals that have no evolutionary or ecological history with each other. So they're kind of naive to each other. And species interactions are generally well-tuned, over evolutionary history. Prey respond to their predators by evolving defenses to reduce predation. Predators then respond to the prey with new strategies to catch them. It's a kind of finely tuned, slow-paced arms race. But when we mix a bunch of stuff together, we don't know what's going to happen. And so that's what we're doing, this natural experiment. This is Antarctica. It's an incredibly unique place. So the continental shelf around Antarctica, going from shallow water, 10 to 50 feet, down to hundreds of meters, is incredibly unique. It's been essentially predator-free for, we think, 30 to 50 million years. So a long, long time. Because the water's too cold for the metabolism of predators that we call them bone-crushing predators, so things like fish, crabs, skates, rays, sharks, none of these things exist in the ocean in Antarctica. So all the prey are they didn't have to evolve defenses. They're enormous. This is an amphipod. Isn't that creepy? It's the size of your hand. We have amphipods here in North Carolina. They're like 5 millimeters long because they're hiding amongst seagrass from their predators. In Antarctica, they don't need to worry about that. There's nobody to eat them. So the bottom is just covered with all these defenseless prey. Anybody know what this is? Sea spider. It's a pycnogonid. We have these in North Carolina. They're all over the docks in Beaufort. You pick up some seaweed, you shake it out. There's all these cute little sea spiders. In Antarctica, they're this big, and they're just kind of like lumbering along the seafloor because there's no problem, there's no threat. That is all going to change in our lifetimes. It's changing really quickly. So the warming of the waters around Antarctica, this is the only predator they have to deal with, the starfish, which is kind of a scary thing, but it's pretty slow moving. This is what's coming. Big, giant spider crabs. You know those things you see from Deadliest Catch? Those are invading the Antarctica continental shelf simply because of warming. And if it warms by another 0.5 degrees Celsius, boom, they'll zip up there, as will sharks, rays, fishes. And the whole system will change, obviously. This is, again, a unique system. going back millions of years, and we'll lose that. And it's essentially a change in function, in process, in composition, and structure. And it's interesting to me as a scientist, but it's obviously problematic for a whole variety of reasons. All right, so in the last couple minutes, what can we do about this? We need to do something really quickly. So there's a big conference coming up in Paris at the end of November, going into early December. As you heard from Charlotte, it's called COP21. It's the 21st time we've had this meeting. It began with the Rio conference you may have heard about. There was a Rio declaration when we first started really globally recognizing that this is a problem. It's like, yeah, we're going to solve this problem as a world community. And we have these meetings every single year. We haven't made a lot of progress yet. I mean, there's been some agreements. A couple of nations are actually following through on what they promised, either initially or at subsequent conferences like the Kyoto Conference. Y'all probably heard of the Kyoto Treaty. So here's what we propose as of October 15th. These are the commitments by countries to essentially reduce their carbon dioxide emissions naturally. So the US will make one, China. So all the world's countries that are party to this treaty have committed. But even if we follow through those commitments, we're still going to see 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's with the commitment. The goal of the conference is 2 degrees Celsius. So it's arbitrary, but it's essentially the goal. We want to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's, of course, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the track we're on now, business as usual. This is if we do nothing, if we keep growing economies and increasing greenhouse gas emissions at the rate we've been doing over the last couple of decades. This is where we are in 2100, 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. For us in North Carolina, that means palm trees, alligators, armadillos. That means the climate of Florida. The average temperature of Florida is only 9 degrees warmer than here. So that much warming is obviously a massive change. New England becomes North Carolina. I mean, these are huge changes. A lot of us will experience that. I mean, armadillos, I'm psyched about. But what can we do about it? So here's the problem. We really need to drastically reduce emissions by 2030. By 2050, we need to have reduced global emissions by about 90% relative to 2005 levels. So we really need to quickly wean ourselves from emissions. And yet, every year we're increasing our emissions. So increase in emissions rate is about 2 to 3% per year. So this is CO2 emissions globally in gigatons carbon dioxide per year, and it's obviously going up and up and up. And what it needs to do is quickly peak and then come back down somewhere around here. And then here is really what the problem is. So the US emissions have actually stabilized and have declined measurably over the last decade or so. That's in part due to changes in our fossil fuel policies. India is a big concern because it's obviously increasing. There's millions of people still there without any electricity. If they increase their economy, if they start to lift themselves out of poverty, obviously they're going to radically increase their carbon dioxide emissions. Look at China. This is unbelievable. When I first started teaching at UNC, the US was by far the world's leading emitter. 15 years later, China is much greater than the US. And it's almost a vertical line. It's just going up and up and up. So China really needs to peak in the next 5 or 10 years and then get way back down here. And that's where we're all really starting to worry. This looks really unlikely that we're going to tackle this. I mean, I want to be an optimist about it, but I mean, this is the time. This December is crucial. I mean, this is the time to really make a big difference. And we're actually hoping that when all these nations go there, they start kind of one-upping each other, like, yeah, we're going to reduce our emissions by 50%, and they get competitive about that. It's wildly optimistic. It's probably not going to happen. But we hope that they don't just walk away with this because, I mean, 6 degrees is better than 8 degrees, but it's still a really frightening world, especially 100, 200 years out. And remember, this is essentially a permanent commitment. I mean, once we warm the Earth by 2 degrees, it's not like it'll cool off immediately once we stop emitting carbon dioxide. This is a many, many thousands of years commitment. There's no going back because those gases stay in the atmosphere unless we figure out a way to remove them with engineering technologies. So all that said, I'm honestly optimistic. My PhD advisor tells everybody that I'm a pathological optimist, and that's probably true, but there are some really great signs. Solar and renewable energy, if you've driven around North Carolina, there's big solar farms popping up all over. It's kind of amazing. The price of solar, the cost of solar energy is now on par with fossil fuels. It's on par with coal, petroleum, and that's unexpected. I mean, the price has plummeted, so it's much cheaper to implement this, and the rate of the increase in solar and other renewable energies is higher than we expected. We'd have to really radically ramp that up, like a World War II scale global mobilization to increase renewable use, but it's possible. The other reason I'm optimistic is because there are so many places I still go, and there's, amazing good news. There's manatee populations have greatly recovered in my hometown. They were like non-existent where I grew up. I saw a manatee maybe once as a child. I grew up on a river next to the ocean. Nowadays in Florida, they're just like bumping off the boats. There's manatees all over. They're like, we have deer here. That's been a massive success story. I work in the Galapagos. There's still sperm whales, manta rays. There's a lot of wildlife out there. So many places still very much worth protecting. There's a lot of other threats, not just climate change. There's overfishing, plastic pollution, but those things we can tackle locally. We just obviously have to tackle this global problem, collaboratively. But I still have optimism. There's just a lot worth doing still. And with that, I want to stop and take some questions, but I'm going to post this on the conference website so anybody can access this. Email me if you want any papers, other PowerPoints, any kind of teaching resources. I'm happy to come talk to your students. So any way I can facilitate the amazing work you guys all do, please let me know. So thank you so much.